Welcome everyone to Asialink's webinar, The International President. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all dialing in from today. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people whose land we will discuss in this webinar. This evening's webinar will be recorded and available to view on Asialink's YouTube channel. If you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A functions at the bottom of your screen, and we will endeavor to answer these questions at the end of the session. I will now introduce our esteemed panel. Please join me in welcoming Gary Quinlan, AO, former Australian ambassador to Indonesia, Professor Dewi Fortuna, Anwar, Research Professor at the Research Center for Politics National Research and Innovation Agency, and Andrew Mantong, Researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Finally, I would like to introduce today's moderator, Don Greenlees. He is a Walkley Award-winning journalist, author, and advisor on international, political, and business affairs. Don is also currently a senior advisor for us here at Asialink. I'll now hand over to you, Don.
Thank you very much, Leah, and welcome to our three speakers and to our online audience. Prabowo Subianto has come to office in Indonesia with the expectation that he will be a foreign policy president, which stands him in marked contrast to his predecessor, Joko Widodo. That expectation is reinforced by reporting from the Kompas newspaper this week that Prabowo, who was sworn in just 11 days ago, is already planning to travel to China and the US, followed by attendance at the APEC summit in Peru and the G20 in Brazil before he goes on to Britain. Prabowo is arguably the most internationally experienced of Indonesia's 8 presidents, having lived and studied abroad as a child, trained overseas as a young military officer, and lived for a period in exile in the late 1990s. There's a consensus among analysts that Prabowo will be both active and in charge when it comes to foreign and security policy. And one clear signal of that is that he has appointed 2 loyalists as foreign minister and defense minister, Gerindra party politician and former soldier Sugiono, and old military ally Shafri Samsudin. Today, we will seek to explore some of the challenges that Prabowo faces in foreign policy and how he might manage them, including what Prabowo's presidency might mean for the bilateral relationship with Australia. As you've heard, our 3 speakers are very well placed to do that, and we will get to audience questions towards the end if you have any. But just to get things rolling, given that we're a few days away from the US election, I thought it would be interesting to go around and get the panel's views on the impact of the elections on Indonesia and the region. And if I can start with you, Dewi, and then go to Gary and Andrew. In a nutshell, Dewi, does the outcome of the Trump-Harris race matter much to Indonesia? And if so, why?
Well, it's difficult to say. Frankly, compared to, say, Australia and other allies of the US in the region, Indonesians are less fixated on the US elections. There's not too much coverage about the US elections, primarily because the focus is very much on domestic issues, Prabowo's cabinet and so on. It's only now that, that the election is coming, that there are now reports about the US elections. When it comes to what does it really matter, I don't think it's politically correct for us to say, we would prefer one or the other. But the Trump presidency was highly destabilizing at the time because it reversed a lot of practices during, the US lost a lot of influence in Asia under Bush, particularly in the war on terror, because it was seen as being targeting Muslims. There's these perceptions that the war on terror is just anti-Islam. And the period of Obama's administration was a period of the US gaining ground again. Barack Obama is highly popular in Indonesia, particularly because of his experience. of living in Indonesia. And then when Trump came, it was very clear that he had a very Islamophobic perspective, which he was not averse of saying that publicly. You know, he was perceived as being anti-Islam, and then his move to relocate the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was, you know, received very negatively in Indonesia. And when Australia followed that move, you know, there was a very strong reaction also from Indonesia. And now, given the fact that the whole focus of Indonesia's foreign policy, the only mention of foreign policy recently is about the Palestinian issue. The inauguration of President Prabowo took place at the Consultative Assembly building, the MPR building, and the chair of the MPR, the long-winded speech about what the president had to do. You know, one thing that the chair of the Consultative Assembly actually said, you know, that the new government has to continue to support Palestinian statehood, to support the end of the conflicts in Palestine. And Prabowo also mentioned that very strongly. So when it comes to the US position in Indonesia, it's not so much of what the bilateral relations are about. It's not so much what the US does in the Indo-Pacific, the China rivalry. For the general public, it is very much the US and its support for Israel.
That's interesting, Dewi, because in the United States, some of the reporting I've seen recently shows that Muslims in places like Michigan are very equivocal about voting for Kamala Harris, and they seem to be
yeah. So equally, yeah. So equally, the Democratic presidency, there was a lot of expectations when Biden came that it would be more multilateral, that more supportive also of Palestinian two-state solution. But there have also been great disappointment because under President Biden and, you know, Vice President Kamala Harris, the strong unequivocal support for Israel and the unwillingness of the US to impose sanctions on Israel despite this clear violation of international humanitarian law. So as far as Jakarta is concerned, you know, when it comes to the Middle Eastern politics, it's not much to choose from. Now, when it comes to
he seems to have a problem with Haitians in Springfield as well. But if I could just halt there for a moment, Dewi, and come to Gary, so we've got a lot to get through. But Gary, you've been head of mission in Jakarta, in Singapore, at the UN, the permanent representative, and also deputy head of mission in Washington. A Trump victory is sometimes portrayed as a terminal occurrence for democracy and key foreign relationships based on past experience with his treatment of NATO and South Korea and other alliances. What do you think is at stake for Indonesia and the region from a Trump presidency?
Look, thank you, Dewi, for sort of conveying a sense of how Indonesians as Indonesians are seeing the current dynamic. It's very important for us to understand that. We did not change policy on Jerusalem and the embassy, by the way. We decided not to. We reviewed it, but decided not to. So we didn't follow the Americans down that very bad track. And of course, the current government is a very different disposition altogether. We are now voting yes on Palestinian issues in the UN, not abstaining and so on and so forth. But that's that particular area. Look, I would think that there would be some concern in the sort of foreign policy establishment in Indonesia and ASEAN more generally, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, about the danger of Trump being too disengaged and leaving a vacuum about places like Southeast Asia with an overwhelming focus, of course, just on China and how he's going to prosecute, you know, a more aggressive form of competition, particularly through trade policy, which is going to be catastrophic potentially for everyone in relation to China, with all the effects that would have on the rest of us, including Southeast Asia. I mean, he did this in an initial way when he was elected in 2016, but it was more selective, his trade approach, and there was some benefit, not to Indonesia specifically, but when a number of Chinese companies were relocated in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on, they were able to benefit. There were 37 of them, I think, and they were able to benefit from that. But now Trump, of course, is saying, in order to prosecute China, if they do that again, or other countries try to take advantage of that trade warfare, and includes Southeast Asia, Mexico, and others in this, and create industries with Chinese investment in them, he will go after them. And so that could really be terribly disruptive, I think, if there's that trade impact. I think that might be one of the biggest impacts you'd worry about. And this binary that the Americans, and it's under Biden as well, have been trying to create about technology and access to new technologies if they are invested by China. And that's going to be very disruptive, particularly to Southeast Asia, which, depends so much on imported technologies for its future economic growth. And, it's one of the world's leading areas of economic growth for the future, anticipated, 3, 4 of the great drivers, but it needs access to that new technology. So Southeast Asia and Indonesia could be caught out, I think, rather badly by that.
And if I could bring in you here, Andrew, I mean, for a moment, if we could hypothesize on a Trump victory, what impact would that have on relations between Jakarta and Washington, in your view? Andrew, I think you've got your mic on mute there.
Can you hear my voice?
Yes,
yeah.
You're on.
Yeah. Given the priorities of President Prabowo today, many people already talk that he's going to be more focused on defense and security development. That would create some opportunities for Indonesia to even get closer to the United States, because the recent trend shows that in terms of defense, we are more integrated in a sense with the US, while on the economic side, we are more deeply integrated with China. But if we look at how Prabowo would engage himself personally in foreign affairs, he might think that there would be some opportunities if Trump wins, given the sort of transactional approaches that Trump would likely to adopt if he became president. And I think Prabowo would have some interest to reach out to him personally to seek some of the concession, to seek some of the commitment that otherwise could not be given to Indonesia. I think for our security matters, for defense matters, that would be great. But, if we are going to talk about Trump and his sort of protectionist and more isolationist kind of outlook for American foreign policy, there might be some worrying trend with regards to the sort of multilateral presence of the US in the region with regards to ASEAN-led mechanism. And
You've frozen there, Andrew. We might have frozen.
That Indonesia might get some sort of agreement on critical minerals with the US.
But the point you're sort of saying there, I think, is that it's going to come down to a very sort of personal, transactional relationship between Trump and Prabowo. Yeah, obviously that's going to be how well they get on together is going to be a critical issue. If I could come back to Dewi, we've seen over the years, quite a few bumps in the road in US-Indonesia relations. Obviously going back to the 90s over East Timor and continuing on from there. I was surprised when I was in Jakarta a few months ago to learn that there had not been an Indonesian ambassador appointed to the United States since the departure of Ruslan Ruslani to come back and join the ministry. Does that send a signal of sort of benign neglect in a way that needs to be rectified? And perhaps that's on both sides, but is that a priority for the new administration in both countries? Yeah.
Firstly, let me reflect again, in the about whether Jakarta will prefer a Harris or a Trump victory. In the past, during the New Order period, the New Order government, that was more concerned about economic development and not too much about democracy and human rights, preferred to work with the Republican Party, the party of big business, and they didn't really care very much about democracy and human rights as long as they could get on with business. And while the Democrats tended to be much more focused on labor rights, human rights, environmental issues, and so on, they changed a bit, during the Bush and then the Obama period. That relations got on better with, under the Obama period, which is much more multilateral. But now it's interesting, Don. Now we have Prabowo, who is very much a new order leftover, put it that way, someone with the military and also some problems. Who until recently did not, until he became Minister of Defense, could not get a visa to go to the US because of allegations of human rights violations, or whether it's over East Timor or during the 1998 transition. So it will be interesting, whether the conventional wisdom that he would have that Trump would have to be more problematic at the personal level, or maybe also at the party level. Maybe Prabowo will be more comfortable. Garinda will be more comfortable, working with a more transactional government than with a more ideological principle government, put it that way.
Yeah. No, I was thinking along the same lines actually, and it led me to sort of think that this may be something that Gary and Andrew and Gary could come in on. That could a Trump victory sort of give license to embolden those who doubt democracy, including Prabowo, to pursue a more authoritarian style of rule, a more authoritarian course? Does this give license to that? Maybe you start on this, Andrew, and we'll come to Gary. We'll reverse the order.
Yeah.
Me first. Oh, that's a tough question. At least on the personal side, Prabowo has promised that he would not topple down democracy in Indonesia. That in some private conversations, he says that he already changed, that he learned a lot from President Jokowi about the needs of, coming together and gotong royong kind of thing for building Indonesia. But I'm more worried about the sort of protectionist and transactional approaches that would be more re-emphasized if Trump win, and the continuing demise of multilateral system, both in regional and global level. And we also at the same time have to understand that democracy does a big deal in maintaining this kind of regionalism and multilateral settings, even if you're talking about ASEAN. The next test, like for example, for Indonesia, at least from the democratic point of view, whether we continue with the Bali Democracy Forum, for example, whether we're going to continue with our democracy promotion as the main principles when we have to engage Myanmar crisis, and so on and so forth. So the fact that there have been less and less reference on democracy at international level, it makes Indonesian approaches to this democracy promotion at regional level getting weaker. And this is the trend that is not going to exclusively begin by Trump. The trend is already starting now.
And Gary, do you very briefly want to chime in on that one?
Look, I agree with Andrew. I think Andrew has sort of said how I would see it. The greater threat is to multilateral cooperation. That's the real threat. And at the end of the day, you get into this debate, who supports democracy, who supports authoritarianism and so on. Fine, that's a debate, but it's not the serious debate we need to worry about. And that is those countries that support rules and those that don't support rules. Because I think that's the greater worry. And as for giving license, if Trump were to win, and I'm not referring to Indonesia or Prabowo specifically here, look, it would merely reinforce the instincts of some people. Just take Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, for example. He's someone like that who's really salivating at the prospect.
Some of them don't need much encouragement.
Winning. Indeed.
Yeah. Andrew made a point earlier on about Indonesia sort of hewing a little bit more to the US and its allies when it comes to military ties, and giving more weight perhaps to China when it comes to economics. And obviously the US-China rivalry is the sort of big issue in regional foreign policy. And if I can come back to you on that point, Dewi, notwithstanding Indonesia's non-aligned policy, how do you see these critical relationships playing out? Do you continue to see that sort of bifurcation of a focus on economics with China and more weight being put on the United States for military equipment, for exercises, for training? I mean, given Prabowo's own military background, that would seem to make sense.
Well, I've written before somewhere that, Indonesia, like most countries in the region, are hedging. They like to, every country, regardless whether you are close ally of one great power or the other, wants benefit from both sides. And at the moment, it's a fact that China offers more on the economic front. It has a huge market, and it also does investment in critical infrastructures that countries like Indonesia need. There's not many countries and not many banks are willing to invest in infrastructure. In the old days, it was the World Bank, that invested in huge infrastructures. But countries like in the United States, where most investment is private sector led, there's no appetite for investing in big infrastructures where the return on investment is long-term and very uncertain. So China offers that what Indonesia needs. China does not really offer what Indonesia needs in terms of sophisticated hardware technology for defense, fighter aircraft and so on. Indonesia has first it was with the Soviet Union, but after that, it was mostly with Western countries, with the United States, with Europe and so on. So yes, it has veered more towards Western countries. But at the same time now, Indonesia, after the embargo, the military embargo imposed by the US after the East Timor ballot and violence, has tried to diversify as well. Indonesia has again tried to buy from Russia, but it's also not wanting to depend too much on the United States. It's bought among the NATO countries as well. It's bought from France, and also now buying more from Turkey. In terms of exercises, it's been with the United States, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And I don't see that as changing.
Including with Australia, we're doing a lot more as well.
Yeah, and now with Australia, in fact, with Australia, that's the one treaty that Indonesia has, the DCA, and has been elevated to a treaty level. And I see that as ongoing. So I've recently published an article in Asia Policy when I said, when it comes to security, Prabowo is very much a realist. And he looked at how national power is being developed, and he looks at both self-help and then, which countries that Indonesia will need to cooperate with, including not just for defense diplomacy, but also for defense industries development. When it comes to economics, he's very much a pragmatist. His all anti-China rhetoric will be toned down, and he's visited China, has his first country to visit after he's really elected, and now he will make sure that he will continue Jokowi's legacy, but he will also want to broaden. In his conversation with Xi Jinping when he visited China in April, he didn't just talk about economic relations. He also wanted to broaden about security cooperation. And with the United States, if you look at the comprehensive strategic partnership, there's a lot of talks about cooperation on the economic side, including technology and including Indonesia's desire to have a critical mineral agreement with the US. Also
under the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, and ensuring also that the GSP is continued, and also the US will support Indonesia's application to the OECD. So trying to broaden, not too much of this bifurcation. That only economic on one side and security. We like to have more economic relationship with the US, but there'll be some element of security cooperation with China too.
Can I get Gary to come in on that one? I think we heard Andrew a bit earlier on, but can you give me your thoughts there quickly, Gary?
Yeah, look, I think that's right, and certainly the diversification, because you want to take the benefit from as many sides as you can if you're in the situation that Prabowo's in, and that's what he's doing. And so all of that is kind of fine. There are some areas with the US as you say, the critical minerals possibility and all the rest of it, and some of the newer technologies which the Chinese and Russians can't provide. There are others who can, of course, the Europeans, the French, South Koreans, and so on. So there will be, I think, that focus to try and extract benefit, particularly on the technology front, not always military technology, but technology for the growth of more sophisticated manufacturing, which is going to be needed to develop, to produce the very high growth rates that Prabowo needs if he's going to be able to implement as much of his program as inevitably domestically would like to do.
Now, I mean, obviously, especially when you're talking about a character like Prabowo, character does matter, and Prabowo himself and his worldview were very much influenced by his upbringing. He had an extensive experience abroad as a youth, studying abroad as a schoolboy, followed by military training in the US and Germany, and then some time in exile after the fall of his former father-in-law, Suharto. I'd like to go to Dewi and Andrew, particularly on this one, that how big a factor do you think these sort of formative experiences were in influencing Prabowo's approach to foreign policy? I mean, for a start, he speaks other languages. He's obviously fluent in English. I understand from his late brother-in-law, Didier, that he used to enjoy speaking French whenever he could, and I imagine his German is sort of passable. So he seems much more at home in international settings than Jokowi was. So how big a factor is this in sort of forming his thinking about international relations? And if out there, Dewi, I can go to Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, the idiosyncratic factor is always very important. You know, so at the end of the day, when foreign policy is not a country, but it's also a leader. And Prabowo is very, very much a cosmopolitan person. He's comfortable and enjoys performing on global stage, and very confident. I find that Prabowo is a much more complex character. You know, he is both cosmopolitan and very he's extremely well read, but at the same time, you know, he's also very strongly, extremely nationalistic, and have a very strong antipathy towards what he sees as foreign interventions. You know, the rhetorics about Indonesia being weak, being intervened by hostile external powers, and how we always resist. You know, this. So it seems to a certain extent, you know, sometimes on the one hand, he's cosmopolitan and very engaged with the outside world. On the other hand, sometimes he sounds quite xenophobic. You know, which part of Prabowo will emerge at one time or the other. It depends very much. You know, I think we'll have to see. He likes to pull the European style, put it that way, quite often. You know, he could be very charming and very engaging, and sometimes when provoked, he could lash out and bring back the memory of colonial exploitations and humiliation and so on, which every so often, you know, will continue to remind us of that.
I mean, with some justice, perhaps he accuses the EU of double standards on trade and protectionism. I mean, you know, the restrictions on Indonesian commodity exports have been supported. The Indonesia's case has been supported by Australia and the US, and it does look like the EU themselves have a bit to answer for in this regard. Yeah. Andrew,
Europeans are experts in hypocrisy, Don. Experts in hypocrisy.
Is that right? Okay.
Most difficult people to deal with in my entire diplomatic career.
And Andrew, do you want to chime in on this one?
Yes, I think we also have to remember that his family is an economist family. They're very solid background as being Indonesian prominent economists. So many of his view would also be influenced by this, but we should not always also forget that he inherited so many baggage from Jokowi administration. Some of the ministries in key position continue their tenure as Indonesian ministries, including finance ministers, and we still see Luhut there. And this also would add to his sort of idiosyncratic factors. In terms of the idiosyncratic factors, I think people would agree that he would focus on military and security defense priorities as a president, given his military training. But also at the same time, he would be more eloquent to become the primary performers of foreign policy. He would engage himself in foreign affairs, and if we look at the recent pattern of his international visit, I think he sees diplomacy more in like an elite-to-elite kind of contact kind of thing. He believed in meeting in person, like face-to-face meeting with world leaders and so on and so forth. Of course, he would be seeking some of the spotlights in multilateral settings, but I think given his realist tendencies, he would be more inclined towards engaging with major powers directly, like for example with US and China. So this probably how his personalistic style would influence foreign policy for myself, for my view.
And earlier on, Dewi, you used the terms hedging. You said that Prabowo was a realist, and you also made the comment that he's sort of quite a complex character. How does this sort of get reflected in his approach to international relations? I mean, it was interesting to discover that the US realist scholar John Mearsheimer had been called to Hambalang to brief the cabinet on his thinking about international relations. And I've heard Prabowo reference Graham Allison, who came up with the Thucydides trap paradigm for US-China relations. There is a real complexity of the way that he approaches these things. Do you see him? I mean, classically, I suppose when you talk about a hedging strategy, you're either going to form alliances, which the Bebas active non-aligned policy tends to mitigate against, or you increase your military power. So how do you see Prabowo managing a sort of a hedging strategy?
Well, I think the fact that he brought, firstly, this is a very interesting fact that Prabowo engaged in this intellectual public forum for his would-be ministers. I think that is quite a first, bringing in prominent speakers and the choice of speakers, Professor John Mearsheimer and so on. I think it's Prabowo's reminding us, because after 10 years of Joko Widodo of economy first, that somehow national security is sometimes sidelined in the interest of economic development. Prabowo is reminding the public again that at the end of the day, the first is national security, and that the economy should be seen as part of very much of national security. And this is, I think, it's not a new playbook for Prabowo, because this is very much new order government. Don't forget that the new order government look at security. It's very comprehensive. It talks about national security, domestic political stability, social harmony, but everything rested on economic development, because without economic development, there will be social dissatisfaction. So economic development is key to political stability, to social harmony. At the same time, economic development is also key to building national power. Only with money can you buy weapons. And only with having foreign exchange can you actually use your economic weight for diplomatic, diplomatic tools. So Prabowo, being a realist, he looks at economic security and national security as, big, two sides of the same coin. I think that he's reminding all of this officials that he was bringing into the cabinet what matters first. And in fact, in my writing about him, about being realist on security, he reminded everyone that in the Constitution, the first vision and mission of the state is to protect the territory and the people, and it's only second that to advance the livelihood of the people. So economic development is at the surface, at the national security. Now, so how will he hedge? he will make sure that, the problem will come about. What happened when there is a challenge? Your question will be, Indonesia has very good relations with China, trade and investment. What happened if there's a crisis in the South China Sea? How will he manage it? I think that Indonesia will try to do both, make sure that we continue to have good relations with China, but also be very firm of what our red line is, that Indonesia will not tolerate infringement.
The bottom line is that, Indonesia, for a country of its size and relative economic strength, has a relatively low level of spending on its armed forces. So it's below 1% of GDP. I mean, surely it's entirely justified for Indonesia to go on a significant modernization of its armed forces when it has clearly significant strategic interests to defend. I mean, not the least of things like illegal fisheries and whatever, but there are concerns around the exclusive economic zone north of Natuna Islands. So I imagine within the body politic in Indonesia, it would be accepted that a significant investment in the military was warranted, right?
Yes, I mean, it's already started under President SBY, the minimum essential, the MEF, the minimum essential force development. It's already started in 2009. It's supposed to go on for 15 years. So 2024 is supposed to be concluded. In fact, we are nowhere near that. Andrew can probably, enlighten us here. It's what, 70% or whatever, despite the fact that there's been increase in defense spending. It's still far below what you call minimum essential force.
I'm sort of fading a bit. Sunshine shining on my camera, but anyway, an unusual setting. Look, Andrew, on that point, do you want to come in as well on the validity of expenditure on an upgraded military, on the modernization of the military?
Sure. I would like to come back to Ibu Dewi's point about the integration of various dimensions of policy, including security and economic affairs. And we may expect that there would be some integration, at least within the foreign policy establishment, that to reflect the acknowledgement that for Prabowo, economy is also part of the security. But also at the same time, this is the thing that that makes me worry. In the past, Indonesian diplomacy has been fixated on various terms, like, for example, ASEAN centrality. Even recently, we talked and made some references on middle power. And the fact that Prabowo invites figures like Marshemers, he talks about national power and so on and so forth, the sort of great power politics heavily influence his views. And this might create some tensions with regards our position as middle power. In the past, our position of middle power, it means that the sort of US-China narrative is not the dominant narrative for Indonesian strategy making. We always try to bring another view, like, for example, this is also the region where Japan remains important, Korea is rising, Australia is getting closer as ASEAN partners, and so on and so forth. I'm afraid that he still lacks some sort of strategy to engage these middle power countries. And this is pretty much important because in the past, the fact that Indonesian economy is not too much integrated with the US, but at the same time, we are somewhat integrated with Japan as the regional hub for production. They made some investment in Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries, and their FDI number now is actually decreasing. And Japan is shifting their attention from economic engagement to military engagement and relying more with the fact as the US allies in the region. It has been pretty much worrying because for Prabowo, it's really going to be complicated in terms of determining which allocation of the budget goes for military development, which allocation of the budget goes for free meal program, and so on and so forth. So at the same time, his equation would not be enough if he sees only the US-China competition in the game. We need more investment from Japan. We need more investment from South Korea. And I'm afraid that when it comes to attracting investment from these countries, we need a serious domestic reform in terms of making better in terms of the ease of doing business and so on and so forth. That still remain unanswered within the current discourse about Prabowo's foreign policy making.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think you wanted to come in there, Gary.
Yeah. Look, just to agree with Andrew again, very much that would be. It's a wicked sort of equation for a military modernization, which has to be done, particularly in the maritime area. We all know that, and there's work underway. He's committed to doubling the current rate of expenditure by 2029, and then taking it beyond. But that only takes it to 1.5% of GDP, the military budget. But at the same time, the very ambitious domestic program on school nutrition, health, and all the rest of it, which is immensely expensive, presents so many different problems to balance the two, because you need the foreign investment, direct investment that Andrew's mentioning. You need that for growth. You've got to maintain reasonable levels of debt, because one of the great things about Indonesia has been the very impressive way it has managed macroeconomic policy. And we're all delighted to see Sri Mulyani being reappointed, her Australian friends delighted. But the other thing is revenue. Until there's a better tax base, it's 11% of GDP. In Australia, we have 27% level of GDP for tax, and the average across the region, oh gosh, this might be out of date by a couple of years now, was something like 18%. So I know Minister Hartarto, who's been reappointed, was working on that very much. What can you do to get the tax system changed? But that's going to have to be a priority, because you must generate more revenue.
Yeah, look, my recollection is that Indonesia was getting that tax take up a bit, so beyond the 11%, but we'll need to check on that. But I want to sort of switch gears here and have a look at Prabowo's foreign policy team. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've got Sugiyono, who is a relative unknown unless you closely follow Indonesian politics. You wouldn't have heard of him. And Shafri Samsudin, who has a long and somewhat controversial history in Indonesian politics as leading that team. I guess I want to go particularly to Dewi and Andrew on this. I mean, what can you tell us about Sugiyono and Shafri? How well suited are they to the challenging task ahead? I mean, it's obviously a very difficult time geopolitically. How much independence will they have from Prabowo? And perhaps you could start, Dewi.
Yeah, I think I will leave our foreign ministers to Andrew. But Shafri is a known quantity. In fact, even before Prabowo, he already served as secretary to Ministry of Defense. So he's very, very experienced. Already working as not just as a former general, but also as a bureaucrat, as a first echelon within the Ministry of Defense. Not under Prabowo, but under the previous administration. Under Prabowo, he continues as a special staff. So he is well versed in that. So I'm confident that he will know what to do. My concern is when we talk about Indonesia's military modernization, we haven't looked very closely at the allocation of the budget, how much it is actually to build Indonesia's deterrence capacity, defense capacity in terms of Air Force and naval buildup, and how much is actually being allocated to the army. As you know, there are talks about expanding the current territorial defense commands from 15 to 38. That each new province will have its own territorial defense command. That will take a lot of resources and human resources, army, and money and budget. So when we look at that defense budget, Andrew, we need to look at how much is actually built in order to ensure Indonesia's modernization of its external defense capacity, and how much it is as a new order playbook of territorial command again, and I think it's important. Now, so since we have the Minister of Defense, somebody from the army, they used to go around. The Minister of Defense in the past has been civilian under Reformasi, but after that we had people from retired military, and it's very much army. You can take the man out of the army, but can you take the army out of the man? In terms of that thinking. So my concern is that Indonesia's defense thinking is still very much focused internally. Domestic security is still paramount. Concerns about separatist movements, instability, and so on. So it's still control of the people, the Indonesian people, and Indonesian territory from internal threats rather than facing external threats. So it seems that Indonesia is still not seriously looking at external threat.
Yeah, and while we're on that subject,
when it comes to Pak Sugiono, I'll leave this to Andrew because, frankly, I do not really know the gentleman.
I'll come back to Andrew in a second, but I'll just stick with you there for a moment. We've got the 2004 T&I law under review by the Parliament, and I think the 2002 police law is also under review. There's an expectation that both forces will receive additional powers, and you're talking about the internal security focus. It's a bit off the foreign policy question in one sense, but how concerned are you about the risk of expanding military and police powers in the country?
Well, there are these concerns, particularly when we're relating it to democratic space. Whether, firstly, from the job perspective, a lot of civilians, higher echelons are worried that there will be less job opportunities for them when armies, when people from the military, active military, are allowed again, to contest or to occupy positions that are really civilians. Because under the existing law on T&I law, active military personnel are allowed to occupy certain bureaucratic positions, but they are very limited and they're actually named. But now, if that's going to be open, that means that, even Secretary General and Director Generals of different ministries could have active military officers, not necessarily making it into a Dewi fungsi again, having the military involved in politics again, but just in terms of personnel management, this is clearly a very competitive atmosphere for the civilian bureaucrats. And secondly, there are concerns of the return of this military again being involved in a lot of domestic security issues. And we are already suffering from democratic regression under Joko Widodo, and whether the new involvement of the military, for example, a lot of focus is now on Papua. That the Ministry of Transmigration has been revived, and this is also related to the development of food estates. To one of the flagship program of President Prabowo is, of course, self-reliant in food security, and that's self-reliance. And one of the project is to open up new food estates in Papua and involving the military to open up lands. Clearly, I've already seen concerns from environmental activists, human rights activists, traditional leaders, that this could lead to conflicts again, conflicts of land, conflict of traditional rights, and just the mere presence of the military opening up land but carrying guns, that the optics could be problematic again.
And so, Andrew, what can you tell us about Sugiano? I mean, he's a relative unknown. It seems that the relationship with Prabowo goes back quite a long way. I've read that Sugiano was sponsored through late high school by Prabowo. He went off to the United States, did a computer science degree, again, I think, sponsored by Prabowo. He's a much younger man. He's 45. Do you know much about how that relationship formed? But he certainly has gone, to considerable heights, deputy chairman of Gerindra Party going into the parliament. But I guess a lot of us really didn't have much visibility of him before this appointment.
Yeah, I think it tells us some future, some trajectories of where Indonesian foreign policy can go from now on. First, it shows that Prabowo is more comfortable working with people who are close to him. And not only Sugiono, but also persons like, for example, Mayor Teddy, who has been elevated as the Secretary of Cabinet. He's more interested, he's more comfortable in working with this kind of close aides, familiar person, and so on and so forth. And for foreign policy, it might be good because in the past, we have witnessed some of the problem of Indonesian foreign policy where the usual ego sectoral problems, where lack of leadership was apparent, for example, under Jokowi's administration. And for this administration, with these close persons working on foreign policy, we can expect more leadership, more executive direction, more leadership in terms of foreign policy making, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it may also create some problem because at least in foreign policy, we also know the terms like, for example, groupthink. In the calculation, in the making of foreign policy, the president needs to be fed up by comprehensive information, by a thorough analysis of cost and benefit of whatever action that he would like to take. This might create the hampers. And the second story of that, if you follow the recent news that Indonesia announced its intention in joining BRICS, for example, it won't happen if the minister is not Sugiono. If, for example, the minister still Retno Marsudi, there would be at least some intellectual debate or some sort of opposition, at least from the foreign ministry, about the risk of joining BRICS, the benefits of joining BRICS, that probably the president would have to adopt second guess when it comes to joining BRICS. But this become one of the key decision and remarkable policy just few days after being sworn in. This shows the fact that this is the trajectory of Indonesian foreign policy ahead if people like Sugiono is going to be placed as foreign policy. It can be good or it can be bad, but if I can also refer back to the question of Indonesian defense strategy, Prabowo did a remarkable jobs in defense procurement and so on and so forth, but still the bigger question here, how Indonesia is formulating its new strategy remains unseen. In terms of the strategy making, for example, usually we talk about what is the actual threats, what is the latent threats, what would be the strategy to go there. So it's defense procurement is just one of the elements that correspond to this kind of foreign policy making. We talk about geopolitics, we invite Mayor Shemar, for example, but we remain inarticulate in making a clear reference of what is threatening for Indonesian national interest, how Indonesia would pursue its strategy, and how defense and procurement and our bilateral relation fit into these kind of questions. These remain answered. We need a better information, but yeah, he likes to go with the comfortable persons.
Andrew, thanks. Look, with the limited time that we've got left, and I'd like to try to stick to roughly about an hour if we could. There are a couple of key subjects I think we should cover, and one is attitudes of the new administration to ASEAN and the relevance of ASEAN. And I'll start with Gary on this, and that is on. I remember going to a presentation that Dennis Richardson, the former Secretary of the Department of Defense and Foreign Affairs, a presentation he gave in Jakarta some years ago, where he talked about the absolute importance of a cohesive ASEAN for Australia's own strategic outlook. And I just want to get just briefly from you, Gary, is there a sort of a sense of disappointment in a way that ASEAN has not been a more effective organization as a problem solver?
Look, yes, I think there is a disappointment there, but sometimes that reflects a failure of some people in the Australian foreign policy establishment to understand the natural limits for ASEAN in ASEAN's terms, because ASEAN has been a pretty successful entity across all our neighbourhood to the north over 50 years, and the contribution to Australian strategic security and stability as a result has been immense. And that's how we continue to see it. I think we feel that under Widodo, it was a bit, Indonesia's leadership, had declined a bit. It was a bit episodic, and ASEAN itself was a bit slow to respond to the changing strategic circumstances in the region and the changed strategic calculus in the region. I mean, some things were done, of course. I mean, the Asia Pacific ASEAN outlook was done, but a little bit too late. ASEAN almost missed the bus in defining how it saw the change in the region and asserting ASEAN's central role in interpreting and trying to shape that change. You know, the 5-point plan on Myanmar was the right thing to do, but again, maybe a little bit more activity, maybe using the humanitarian part of the plan in particular as the entry point more forcefully into trying to do something there. So I think there's been a little bit of disappointment there. Our anticipation is, but please, this is where I need to be educated by both Dewi and Andrew, is that Prabowo will be more active and engaged on the ASEAN front in terms of leadership in particular, because he's a natural leader. That's how he sees himself, and he will want to do stuff which will be more active. And I think the region, certainly the couple of people I've talked to over the last couple of weeks from a couple of key ASEAN countries sort of see that as a big plus, and they're looking forward to that and certainly hope that's what he will do.
So, Dewi, how do you answer Gary's prompt there, his question?
Yes, this is also coming back to touching what Andrew said earlier about Indonesia's middle power position. In my writing, I say, you know, Prabowo is realist on security, pragmatic on economic development, but he's an idealist when it comes to regional international cooperation, because he talks about 1,000 friends, 0 enemies, and the importance of good neighbor policy. Every so often, you know, he always refers to good neighbor policy. And don't forget, I say, you know, Prabowo grew up under the New Order government. ASEAN was created by the New Order government. This is part of the outlook, yeah, about that you cannot have national security without having regional peace and stability. So having good relationship with neighboring countries are key to allowing Indonesia to focus internally in its domestic development and to invest less money on buying you know, boats, gunboats and fighter aircrafts, and more money on human development. So you know, you're right that Indonesia is underinvesting in military hardware because, you know, its perspective has always been comprehensive security. So despite the fact that Prabowo is a realist, he's very much steep in that strategic culture that's been there since the New Order government. So I think that he will continue to focus on ensuring that Southeast Asia, ASEAN enjoys peace and stability, strategic autonomy, and ASEAN centrality. He will want to you know, it is not a new playbook for him. Suharto was seen as the grand old man of ASEAN for a time. He didn't say much, but when Indonesia didn't say anything, people tended to look to Indonesia, you know, what Indonesia wanted. Now, ASEAN is wider. That silent leading from behind no longer works very well. Sometimes Indonesia needs to speak up more, yes, and not just using the Solonese silence as indicating displeasure, which is not always understood anymore.
I recall that it was either SPY or Jokowi in the early days sent Agus Wijaya to Myanmar, hoping that a military guy might be able to talk sense into the regime. Prabowo, as a former general himself, do you think he would fancy some ability to influence and moderate the behavior of the junta in Myanmar?
Probably he would, yeah. Probably he does say, you know, you don't have to seize power in order to become president and have everybody supporting you. SBY tried to do that. And for a while it worked, but you know, so maybe, you know, I do expect that we'll see some change in Indonesia's policy towards ASEAN and towards Myanmar here.
Now, Andrew, if we could keep it very tight, I don't know if you want to come in on that, but I'd like to get a couple of questions in on the bilateral relationship before we wrap. So do you want to add to the ASEAN discussion, or we move on?
Yeah, I think I can add some elements. Just to compare with Jokowi back then, he was not really interested in ASEAN. But the fact that our foreign policy has much been fixated on ASEAN in terms of the diplomatic channels, it sort of finding its way to Indonesian foreign policy, and that I think that the same would also happen to Prabowo. But I think every Indonesian president, if they would take ASEAN seriously, they will have to acknowledge the fact that ASEAN has some sort of limitation, and that limitation can only be ameliorated if we sort of revise or reform ASEAN. If there is no political will in doing that, and I think the best thing that we can expect for Prabowo is to engage himself in sort of symbolic and a more leadership presence in Southeast Asian countries, but not in the making of more substantive reforms in terms of ASEAN. That would be another energy that I think I have not really find any kind of signs within his talks whatsoever about ASEAN up until today.
Okay. Now, look, we've crammed in a lot, but I don't think we can leave without a brief discussion of the bilateral relationship with Australia. And I'll obviously come to you first of all on this, Gary. And my colleague Robert Law wrote a piece today saying that maybe this is a time for Australia to rethink its strategies in dealing with Indonesia. Under Prabowo, what should we be doing with the relationship? Should we be thinking about different approaches? And if we do think about different approaches, what should they be?
Look, look, the relationship is in a very good spot historically, but it's unbalanced. It's in a very strong position politically. And, I believe that will continue with Prabowo. Look, the risk is something terrible were to happen in Papua, and which could create some concerns among some Australians in the media and so on. So we'll need to just hope that nothing goes wrong there, because we've been basically supportive of the approach of development-led change in Papua and so on and so forth. And we're hoping all of that will achieve something, but it's very long-term. Politically strong, we all know economically it's very underdeveloped, and that's where the focus is of the current government, our government here in Australia, and it would if there were a change of government in the elections next year, to do more and more to encourage trade and investment. And that is a long-term thing, and it's really hard. Australian business, as you know, Don, is too risk-averse and too focused on short-term profits for putting in the more patient kind of investment that is needed to lift our game in Southeast Asia generally, not just in Indonesia. So there's a lot of effort there is going on. I mean, we have a new economic strategy was developed by a very senior business person in Australia, Nicholas Moore from Macquarie. And there's a whole series of new kind of operators that have been put in place in Indonesia and elsewhere to encourage business connections and investments, special business champions, landing platforms, sectoral business missions. But you've just got to keep doing more of all of that. So that's happening. But the focus, I think, will be very much on the economic side, because on the defence side, we've got the new agreement, and politically, I think we're in a very good spot. We in Australia
need a defence agreement, isn't it? I mean, if you go back to the Bali bombing and the period after the Bali bombing, I mean, it was an extraordinary level of interaction between the Australian security forces, the police, the AFP in particular, and the INP in Indonesia. We're actually in a pretty healthy state on the security side of the relationship. It's really economics that's lagging, right? It's
economics, and on the security side, frankly, I admire the way in which, since Bali, successive administrations in Indonesia have been able to deal with the security issue. We do have very intimate relations in that area. In fact, before the Gaza war, the closest police relationships anywhere in the world were in the West Bank, between the Israeli Defense Forces and the Palestinian Authority. Now look what's happened there. But second was the Indonesian and Australian security. Yeah. It was the closest in the world, no doubt about it. And that's fantastic. It's as it should be.
Having said that, do you think we've overcooked the Indonesia-Australia, the latest security agreement? I mean, I saw some pretty some pretty extraordinary rhetoric about the significance of that relationship historically. I think the Indonesians might have a different perspective. Do you think we've overplayed it?
Yeah, look, the rhetoric was a bit hyperbolic and all the rest of it. But when you look at the substance, it's pretty good. And when it was signed in Jakarta, Prabowo himself was more forthright in what he said about it, and the Defence Ministry were, in terms of, interoperability, training, education, more complex exercising, all of that as you'd expect. But interestingly, using language like saying it would help us, Indonesia and Australia, and this is the language of the Defence Ministry in Jakarta, to anticipate security challenges in the region. Now, that's a good thing, because what it's saying is the stronger the operational resilience between two players like Indonesia and Australia in these areas, the better for the region as a whole as well. So I think, there's great prospectivity there, but we shouldn't overstate it, because, we're just going to have to see what comes up.
Yeah. Okay, look, just finally, if I can quickly go to Dewi and to Andrew on this, and feel free to pick up on the comments that Gary made. But I guess my question to you is, where does Australia rank, you think, in foreign policy priorities now for the new administration?
Well, I think Australia is one of our closest friends. There's a lot of goodwill towards Australia. Indonesia, in general, do not get too fixated about our neighbors to the south. You don't make it to headlines too much, as opposed to Australia being, more concerned about to the north. And I think that's usual. Unless there are troubles in the bilateral relationships, usually they don't really get into the news. But Australia is recognized as being, very, very close friends. When it comes to the geopolitics, we have been on the same page, except recently over AUKUS, the Indonesian Prime Minister was much more critical, but the Defense Ministry tended to be much more realist in this. So this is interesting, whether President Prabowo will be much more realist in this and sees that, deterrence is deterrence. And maybe that's much more accepting. But there's a danger. Like Pak Gary has mentioned about Papua. Even in the best of times, remember when President SBY was just visiting Papua, came back a week later, and then there was this asylum seekers and everything went haywire again. Now my concern is if there's things happening. And then the Australian media, civil society, the church, as you know, are very active and are becoming critical. That could, again, affect bilateral relations. And if there's uncomfortable questions from the media, if President Prabowo visits Australia, despite the very good government-to-government relations, you can never ask the media not to ask our hard questions. And that could also create uncomfortable moments.
Okay, so Andrew, very briefly, the final word goes to you. What's your take on bilateral relationship? How do you rank?
We in CSI we are making a new proposal of Indonesia's diplomacy. One of the key proposal is actually involving Australia. We noticed that if we follow the natural course of event, there would be some and more ties with China. And this, of course, if we want to maintain the free and active foreign policy, there has to be balanced in terms of, for example, the future of critical minerals, the future of green transition, and various regional agenda, like, for example, humanitarian disaster relief, disaster management, and so on and so forth. We need a new partners in terms of, especially when we are talking that ASEAN have some of the limitations, that there would be some of the sensitive issues if we are going to deal directly with China and the US. And just to, for example, balance Indonesia's recent proposal in joining BRICS, we also need to deal and to make ourselves closer to the West and Western alliance. And I think Australia could be the good interlocutor for Indonesia to keep whatever talks about rule-based international order, about regionalism, and so on and so forth. So for some of the part that we are thinking now, for example, that why don't we try something new, for example, like making a unilateral new arrangement between Indonesia, Australia, and other like-minded countries, like, for example, South Korea. We see that the economy is pretty much complementary. we buy into same sort of regional outlooks. There have been some common issues with regards to, for example, humanitarian disaster relief and so on and so forth, then that would be great. The fact that I agree with Ambassador Gary that, you know, foreign policy in Indonesia sometimes does not go to public opinion debate. And that is quite fortunate for Indonesia's bilateral relations with Australia, because I think there have been some substantive signs of bilateral relations. Like, for example, the creation of GCLEC, how much Australia support Indonesian police and Indonesian education system in countering and in counter violent extremism issues, like, for example. This creates some track records that could be a good modalities, and I think Prabowo knows that. So there would be some, modalities to build and to even tap into a new framework, like, for example, trilateral framework or even another agenda within ASEAN. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Look, thank you to our panel, to Dewi, Fortuna, Anwar, Gary, Quinlan, Andrew, Mantong. You've been terrific, and we look forward to getting you back at some point in the future. I'll hand back to Leah for a final word.
Thank you, Don. And thank you, Gary, Dewi, and Andrew. It was a really insightful conversation. A recording of today's webinar will be available on Asialink's YouTube channel if you want to revisit any of today's insights. And I would also like to remind everyone that Asialink has another webinar coming up in about 2 weeks on the 14th of November, titled The Next US President in Asia. John McCarthy will moderate a panel of experts from across the region, unpacking Asian perspectives on the outcome of the election. Thank you again to our speakers and also to you, our audience. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.